Welcome to our next session in our series on technology and safety. Tonight we will be talking about how to make sound technology choices. And before I go further, a reminder to anybody, this session is being recorded. If you have any questions, feel free to either drop them in the comments or at the end, you can ask them verbally if you want, but please, in the meantime, keep yourself muted, and I will respond. If you want to ask a question, you don't want your voice recorded, you don't want your name, just type up in the comments and I will deal with the question without having to identify you. Okay, so tonight's topic is, how do you make technology choices? So the first thing to really understand about this is that not making a choice is actually making a choice of a different sort. Seems easier, it feels easier because you don't have to consciously think something through, but ultimately it's a choice to not think things through. It's a choice to just let things go as they happen without really looking at the upside and the downside and being responsible about how things will play out. Now, obviously, we can do all the thinking and planning we want. As I say, I mentioned got blocked, but at the same time, it also says that Derech Shadam Reitze, right? That Hashem takes us in the direction where we want to go. If we make the effort to try to go in the right way, Hashem, we will have some siyata d'shmaya. We will not have, you don't get siyata d'shmaya if you're not willing to put in the effort of thinking things through and doing the best you can. So that's the starting point. You have to really just, every time you need to make a decision about these things, you have to think it through. Please do not mind my taking a sip of hot water. I made a bracha. Okay, so the first thing you need to understand is, when something comes up, what are you trying to accomplish? Whether it's getting a piece of technology, getting rid of a piece of technology, changing the technology you have, whatever. If you're not sure about what to do, the first thing you have to think about is, what am I trying to accomplish? And is what I'm trying to accomplish realistic within the parameters I have, right? I'm thinking of getting internet. I'm thinking of getting rid of my internet. What am I trying to accomplish, right? So if you think that, okay, I'm going to get rid of my internet and therefore all of my problems with my child's, school are going to disappear, not realistic, okay? You might say, okay, I'm going to get rid of my internet because I have this particular problem. I have a child who is addicted and he manages to break all of my security. Talk to a professional, but that may be, realistic. So you have to really think through what it is you're trying to do, and you have to be realistic about it. So you think, okay, is this what I really want to accomplish? It is actually theoretically possible for me to accomplish it with this thing. Let me think through whether it is theoretically, but so theoretical that it doesn't really matter, or if it's, a reasonable, realistic thing that I can do. So that's step number one. Step number two is, every single decision has its upside and its downside, right? So first step is you're thinking about the upside of the decision you're planning to make, whatever that decision is. Now you also have to think about the downside. And it's important to recognize that even things that seem on the surface like, oh, this is the fun thing to do, or this is the smart thing to do, that may be true, but there are still downsides, right? So getting rid of your internet may be a good thing, but there are going to be downsides to it. Those downsides may be worth it for you and in your situation, but there are going to be downsides. By the same token, getting a smartphone can really be immensely convenient. I own a smartphone. I use it very heavily, but there are downsides to them. That's one of the reasons I'm doing this series, right? Because all of these technologies have downsides, and you have to really think through on a real basis. But what you have to be careful of, I'm sorry, my grandkids are here. What you have to really think through is, what are the real issues, okay? Because, you hear all sorts of, things, both good and bad. The assumption that if you shop online, you will save money. maybe. I can tell you that there have been times in my life where shopping online saved me an enormous amount of money. For me, currently, shopping online saves me some money, but more of what it does for me today is saves me time and effort. Okay, so you have to know, like, is this real? By the same token, I mean, I've heard, people talk about, the evils of online shopping, and there are some problems. There are some real problems, but some of the things that I've heard presented about online shopping are like, this is what we call scare lore. Okay, it's not; these are not real issues for most people. So whenever you think about how, what to do, you have to say, okay, these are the things I'm trying to accomplish. These are the real issues, but these are the real issues. Don't get yourself, just like you should not get yourself stuck in over the overhype of the wonderful benefits of a technology. You also need to make sure you don't get yourself stuck in the overhype of the dangers of a given technology. Again, I'm not saying that the dangers aren't there, but you have to know what the real dangers are, because then you can look at, okay, what are there any mitigations, and what are those mitigations? Are they realistic and practical for me or not? And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So but once you have that list, you can start dealing with it. The next thing you need to look at is your budget. Okay. And there are real costs, and again, very often real savings involved in almost any technology decision that you make. You get a smartphone, you get internet access, you get a computer, whatever. So there are four general numbers that you need to look at. One is your initial purchase cost, right? You're buying a new computer, you're getting internet in your house, you're getting a smartphone. What is the computer going to cost? What is the smartphone going to cost you? What is the installation of internet in your house going to cost? Are you going to need other, equipment, whatever? So that's your first cost. Your second cost is, what's the ongoing cost? For instance, everybody understands with internet access, there is a monthly cost to your internet access. Okay, excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. There is an ongoing cost. So what is that monthly cost going to look like? Okay, but when you look at your costs, you have to look at your true costs, right? Like when I spoke about, safety first, right? When you're looking at your budget, part of what you're looking at is security. Okay, so which is the third area is ancillary costs, other things that are not direct. So you have the cost of your internet access. Now, what am I doing to filter so that when I'm sitting, I'm less likely to make mistakes, to make sure that my kids just can't get on the internet, spend hours playing games or whatever? What are there is a cost to that. You have to factor that into your budget from the beginning when you start thinking about it, whether it's a cell phone, a smartphone, internet access, whatever it is. What are those other costs that are going to be, you're going to have to factor in? In some cases, if you're planning to have a smartphone, the replacement cost, most smartphones don't last that long. And so you have to think about that. This is what it's going to cost me to get one. What is it going to cost me to replace it? And how often will I have to replace it? And that can be how often you have to replace a smartphone or a computer, whatever. It depends on a lot of factors. So you have to think those things through. But again, these are all pieces of the budget that you really should be thinking about. Again, but when you're looking at what's your total budget, you absolutely, the added costs are really crucial. And the single most common cost that shows up, that people have failed to think about is security. And I mean security both in the pragmatic sense of making sure you don't get hacked, your emails don't get stolen, etc. But also the more the safety of the more general safety, such as filtering, parental controls to enforce schedules, etc. This is something that you need to factor in from the get-go. And I'm going to say up front, there are some free products out there. Don't use them. By and large, most people should not be using the free products. There are some exceptions. For instance, and both Android and Chrome do allow you to do a lot of stuff, if you know what you're doing. But there are certain limitations. Same thing is true, by the way, for Apple. There are certain limitations on what you can and cannot do. And in all of these cases, you really need to know what you're doing. It's a lot easier, frankly, to get a good product that helps you, walk through this and it adds a layer of functionality that you can use. So this is important for many people. Doing this themselves, even with these products, is not realistic, which means you need to factor in the cost of a service such as Tag or Mashim or whatever. There are different, depends on the community you're in, but being willing to pay for outside help, and there are professionals say, oh, you can do it yourself, and it's true. I mean, I have never taken my phone to Tag, but there are people who, for whatever reason, cannot do it themselves. They're not professionals. They don't have, they either they're not professionals and they're not confident in their knowledge. Maybe they just don't know enough. Maybe sometimes it's more useful to have an outside person be the expert. Whatever the reason is, again, if that's what you need, it's fine. Just again, factor that cost in from the get-go. It's really important. On the flip side, we're talking about the cost, but also what savings can you get from this? And not always will you be able to get savings. But like I said, for many people, for instance, shopping is a huge deal. Because even if what they're shopping for is not cheaper, but the fact that they don't have to go out and leave the kids with a babysitter, they don't have to worry about transportation, etc., can be a cost saving. Just as an example of one real world cost. Another real world cost, that I've seen for mothers of young children, if they have a job that allows them to do some of their work from home, they will leave the office early enough to be home when the kids get home, thus not needing a babysitter. And then in the evening, they will work an extra hour or two, whatever, but no babysitter. That's 2 hours of babysitting 4 days a week. That can add up quite significantly, even if you're sending your kid out to babysitter and you're paying, it's one kid going to the babysitter for 2 hours a day for 4 days a week at $6 an hour. That's 8 hours at $6 an hour times 4.5 weeks. That's, going to pay, that pays for more than most internet, services cost. Again, you have to know what applies to you. Okay. But it's really important. Now, this brings up an interesting point, that it's really important to remember that whatever decision you make today is a decision that you should be willing to revisit either when circumstances change or when you see that something is not working out the way you thought it would, right? So for instance, babysitting as a cost is relevant to people who have kids who are old enough to go to school, but too young to be left by themselves, right? There are people who don't have children that age. So for them, this is not a saving. Now, once you hit that point where all of your kids do not need you to be home when they get home, they do not need to go to a babysitter, right? So then you may want to step back and say, okay, the finances have changed. Does that change anything for me? Okay, you may still want to, do the work from home for other reasons. The flexibility may still be worth it for you. But the point is that periodically it's worthwhile to step back and say, has anything changed that makes it worth changing what I'm doing? And also periodic to say, are things working the way I expected them to? Am I getting the benefits? Are there downsides that I didn't expect? Are those things that I should really think about? So that's the other really big thing. Once you've looked at your budget, both in terms of the cost versus the savings, what your issues are, then you have to look, okay, what mitigations can I put in place, right? So you've got a kid who was is really into stuff, trips, whatever. You're going to take, so you can put a mitigation in that you're going to get a really good filter. You're going to go to Tag, they're going to put in a really good filter, and that, with passwords, etc., that your kid is not going to be able to easily hack. Okay, so that's a mitigation, right? Maybe you're worried about, if you have social media on your smartphone and you're going to do what's called doom scrolling, and that's a real concern. There are people who do that, right? So you may say, okay, I am going to take my phone. I'm going to, put, or it might, like for instance, in my family, some of my children have asked me to be their equivalent of Tag. I've put, certain apps on their phone, and that's all. Obviously if they want other apps, they'll talk me up with mom, but this keeps them from just like on the spur of the moment putting on an app that they know that in the long term is really not something they want on there, right? So you can do that. There are ways in many cases to mitigate. You have to, again, be very realistic and very honest. Are these things that I can mitigate? If the answer is yes, then that, you know, pushes towards the point of saying yes to whatever the decision is. If you cannot, then that pushes towards no. And then you have to, again, make that balance. But part of the balancing act is thinking of what are the mitigations, what are the things that I can do to, you know, to make things better with this decision. And, you know, sometimes there are good choices and sometimes there aren't good choices. And, you know, you have to be realistic about it. Once you've looked at that, then you want to step back and say, okay, these are my core issues. Okay. Are there other things that I should like think about, right? So just as an example, Uber and Lyft are really very, very convenient things. For most people, having Uber and Lyft on your phone is a good thing, but that's not the key reason you're getting a smartphone. Okay. It's just one of those things that if you're kind of on the fence, you might look at that and say, you know what? I really need to take transportation where I can't take public transportation. It's hard to get a car service. So this is really a nice advantage, you know. By the same token, you may decide that, you know, the disadvantage of the phone that, you know, some people just like, they simply cannot, you know, put down their phone, and you can, you know, sing and dance all you want. You can try all the mitigations. This person is going to be busy with their text, you know, from here till, you know, as long as the text, they're going to pick up their phone and look at the text. And that's a downside. That's a really big downside, even if, you know, so you have to really look at, you know, or you may just decide, you know what, I can afford this, but it's more money than I want to spend. That's a real thing, etc. So these are all things you have to look at. You know, these are upsides, these are downsides. You know, getting rid of your smartphone if you've been a user of Uber or Lyft is, you know, a downside. So again, you know, you need to like go back and just think about that, just in case that thing is significant enough that even though that wasn't part of your initial thought process, you don't want to like forget about that. So that's your general thought process for any technology thing. So let's talk about specifics. Okay. So how do you decide about getting a smartphone or a cell phone or neither? Okay. So the question is, who are you getting this for and what do you need the phone for? So say your kid comes to you and says, Ma, Pa, I want a smartphone. What for, right? What's really, when you're dealing with your kids, it's very important to go through this process, understanding what they're thinking, okay? In other words, you have a certain, you know, a certain attitude, you have certain knowledge. And obviously as the parent, especially when your kids are younger, you have to make certain decisions for your kids. But it's very, very important to hear your child out, to take their concerns seriously and not to nitpick them. To give you a very classic example, something comes up. Kid comes to the parent and says, Ma, I want a phone. I want a cell phone. Not even a smartphone. I want a cell phone. You ask them why. Everybody has a cell phone. And your response is, really? But Sasha Dvasha doesn't have a cell phone. Now, that may be true. There may be one girl in your daughter's class who doesn't have a cell phone, but that's not really what your daughter meant when she said everybody. She did not mean everybody in the sense that literally every single solitary girl without exception. She meant Ruba Kikula, most of the girls, anybody who is quote unquote normal and part of the class and, you know, with it has a cell phone, right? And that may be true. And when you nitpick and say, but this one girl doesn't have a cell phone, you're not really responding to your daughter's, you know, issue. Doesn't mean that just because everyone has a cell phone, she should get a cell phone. But you have to look at the actual thing she's looking at, rather than the than like kind of nitpicking and arguing your kid on technicalities, basically. Now, and this is also a classic example as well. You know, it's like, oh, well, just because everybody jumps off the Brooklyn Bridge, are you going to jump the Brooklyn Bridge? And that is a valid argument, except for one really important thing. Do you do things, or do you expect your children to do things because that's what everybody does, right? So, which is to say, again, not necessarily the fact that everybody has a cell phone, should you get your child a cell phone, but unless you are somebody who, for whatever reason, is comfortable and consistently willing to go against the stream and do things differently than everyone else, it's kind of hard to tell your child no just based on that. Now, there are some parents, like, shluchim, right? Many of them, they spend their life doing things differently than everybody does. So for them, yeah, that's a normal thing. Like, just because everybody's doing it, listen, we're the only ones who are kosher in this town right now, right? We're the only ones who are not Machal Shabbos in this town. So obviously, I mean, it's not always that extreme, but there are people who spend a large part of their life doing things differently. So for them, saying just because everybody's doing that is a no-brainer. Okay. So it's important when you make that kind of argument, especially with your kid, to be balanced there. Okay. And I do, by the way, have a lot of sympathy for, just because everyone's doing it doesn't mean you should do it. But as a parent, you also need to realize that if everybody, whether literally everybody or almost everybody, is doing something, that can make a significant difference to your child. I mean, just to take an example of something that should not have happened, is one kid I know whose mother did not want, she had a cell phone for pragmatic reasons, but her mother did not want her to have a smartphone. But the problem is that there were maybe 3 kids in a class of 20 who didn't have a smartphone. And the teacher was WhatsApping information to the kids, to the students. This is in high school. And, her daughter was really, kind of, it was creating a problem for her daughter in class. And, it created a dynamic. And her mother finally said, look, okay, I will get you a smartphone and we're going to put a filter on it. We're going to put parental controls, and these are the only apps you can have, et cetera, et cetera. And, you're not getting the most expensive one because there's really, you don't need the most expensive one, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what they did. Right. And again, it shouldn't have happened because the teacher should not have been WhatsApping the students. It was actually not school policy, but the mother, for good and sufficient reasons, did not feel that she could be the person to kick up a fuss about it. So that's an example of needing to understand what the real deal is. Okay. So again, but when you're looking at that, okay, you have to look at, okay, what is that cell phone going to be used for? Why are you getting it? What are the upsides? What are the downsides? With kids, okay, the younger the child, the more quickly my answer is going to be no. Okay. If your child needs to travel alone, I tend to be much more on the, give them a cell phone because emergencies crop up, things happen, especially if they get delayed in school or whatever. And something that I'm going to say, if you're like of my cohort or a little bit younger, a lot of us, go to the school office and call if you get delayed. Go to a payphone. Well, I'm just going to remind all of you people who say those things that payphones do not exist in most cities anymore, even in the airports. So in the airports, there are a few payphones that you need a credit card for. I don't think you want to hand your kid a credit card either, right? Most schools, I don't think there is a school in New York, for instance, that has payphones in school. The subway system no longer has payphones. There are no payphones on the street. Payphones are a thing of the past. That's a reality. So you can't say, well, my kid can, go to payphone. Go to the school office, really? Again, things have changed. From the time I was in school to the time my children were in school, things changed. And I remember how hard it was to get a hold of my child if I needed to in an emergency, and it happened once or twice. I mean, Baruch Hashem, nothing earth-shattering, but things that really were important. And my kids could not get a hold of us if they needed to, even though I had a cell phone, my husband had a cell phone, because nobody was letting them use the phone in the office. And this was before cell phones were so common. Today, most schools will not, they tell you that they don't want that the kids to have cell phones, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. but most schools will not allow the kids to use the phone in the office. Okay, so again, I mean, so for most kids, it doesn't matter. You know, the chance of really needing to get a hold of your child or your child needing to get a hold of you is low enough that I'm going to say, eh. But if your child is traveling to and from school on their own, right, then it starts, you know, changing. It starts changing the whole calculation there, because then they do need to get a hold of you, and difficulties in school, et cetera, start becoming an issue. If your child is home alone a lot, and you don't have a landline, if for whatever reason, you know, there's no landline, there's got to be something, etc. So, you know, um, I can tell you that if your child is boarding, by the way, if your child is out of town and boarding, absolutely your child must have a cell phone. I don't care what they tell you. Children, and this was true when I was in high school, and it's still true now. If your kid is boarding somewhere, they're not going to have as much access to a phone as you want them to, and they will not have private access to a phone, which you always, always, always want your child to have private access to a phone if they are boarding, or even if they are in a dormitory. So that's an example of where, you know, the need of your child to be able to contact their parents becomes, you know, very, very, again, by the way, this is not 100%. There are situations, for instance, there are yeshivas where the boys are not allowed to have cell phones, and there is an effort made by the Hanhala to make sure that the boys can make and receive calls as needed. Okay, so, you know, I'm not saying 100%, but, you know, this is the kind of situation where you must make sure that this exists, that, you know, this access exists, etc. This is, you know, smartphones are a lot trickier. And again, the younger the child, the less my tendency is to say yes. And this, by the way, is where I must do a shout out to Must, because even with smartphones, who has one matters, because if the teacher, if most of the class has smartphones, and therefore things like WhatsApp are being used, if most of the class has one and the teacher decides that she's or he is going to take advantage of that and start using the capacities of the smartphone, even and this happens, by the way, even in situations where the school policy is not the school policy. Just by the way, I've seen this happen more than once, where there's technology used by teachers that is absolutely not in the school, that is not in the school policy, or that's against the school policy, and the teacher doesn't even realize. She or he, but usually it's a she in my experience, is so just like, this has become so normal that she hasn't even thought through the fact that this is actually against school policy. So it's rarely, I'm going to say this, you know, even when a teacher does this, it's rarely deliberately flouting school policy, but it happens, right? So this becomes a real problem. If you're a Must classroom, then that takes an enormous amount of pressure off you and your kid to get that device. Okay, so that's really, you know, and one of the things I really like about Must, just parenthetically, is that they looked at a problem and they said, you know, one of the really big things that's driving this thing that we're seeing is this peer pressure and the network effect, essentially. So, and that's something we can do something about. So we can't deal with the other problems, but we can do something about that. So let's do something about that. And I love that pragmatic approach that allows you to do something, at least in some cases. It doesn't solve for all situations, but at least, you know, for one set. So generally speaking, I'm going to say that kids, that kids below high school should not, probably don't need cell phones, and generally should not have smartphones. But again, it depends on what's going on in the rest of the classroom. And if you are going to get a smartphone for your child who is high school in the SIFCA age, absolutely get parental controls on there, get the filtering on there. This is non-negotiable. And if your kid pushes back on that, that tells you that you've got bigger problems. And then you have to rethink a lot of decisions. Okay. Computer. Okay, so computers are useful for a lot of things. Now, first of all, there are many, many schools, again, it's not the official policy. But realistically speaking, especially with girls, um, there are a lot of schools where it's very hard for girls once they hit, especially once they hit high school, to be able to really do all of their schoolwork without a computer. Teachers don't like handwritten reports and papers and book reports and what have you. The Limmud Kodesh teachers, just like the Limmud Chol teachers, projects get done cooperatively. And if you're doing cooperative, projects, you're winding up with email or using the USB key to transfer stuff, etc. So the thing you need to really think about is what is the real situation. Again, talking about with kids in the house, not what is the school policy, okay? Although yes, you should look at the school policy, but what is not just what is the official school policy, but what is the actual behavior of the school. If the teacher, for instance, is telling students, email me your part of the project, then whatever the school may say about their policy, obviously teacher's policy is everybody's expected to use a computer. And even if you don't have internet access in the house, at minimum, she's going to want you to bring a USB key in and hand it to the teacher, right? So you have to give a look at what the school's official policy is and what's actually happening in the classroom. And this is really, really important. Now, if the school's policy is X, whatever that policy is, and they actually enforce it, the classroom is consistent with the policy, okay, then that's a really big strike against doing whatever it is, whether it's getting internet access, cell phone, smartphone, computer, etc. This is very, very important. It's extremely important to realize. And the other thing that's important is don't lie, right? If doing this thing means that you have to lie, my feeling is don't do it. Even if there's all sorts of good reasons, lying about it is just not the way to go. And if this is really so important that you're willing to lie about it, maybe you need to rethink your school choice, okay? Or maybe you should, tell the school, I understand why you have this policy, but in our case, it is not possible because of X, Y, and Z. Just to take an example, a real world example of an issue, a lot of, schools that have a policy that the parents can only have smartphones if it's for parnas, right? Now, I happen to know that there are several schools that require, and these are mostly special ed schools, but not just, that they require the parents to actually have one parent to have a smartphone that uses a specific app that tracks the children's bus route. And this is why it tends to be special ed schools, because these kids, when the bus shows up, somebody has to be waiting for the child. And they cannot come and beep and wait for the parent to come out, et cetera, et cetera. The parent needs to, so the only way for the parent to be waiting for the child is for them to have this app, right? So if you are a parent, I'm using this as just a general example, who has this situation going on, you should be able, hopefully you can talk to the school and say to them, look, I get it, but my child is from school, but this is what they require for the safety of the children. And I cannot not do that, right? And, so I'm telling you up front that I am not doing this. In some cases, I had a situation many years ago where the school promulgated a new policy that there was no way I was going to go with it. And in that case, I did not have a conversation with the Hanhola, but I did send back all of the forms, and I did not sign. I sent back the unsigned form. Anybody who was paying attention knew that I had refused to sign that form because all of the other forms were signed and this was unsigned. The Hanhola knew me, okay, and they knew that I wasn't being stupid. The rule had not been honestly, the rule had not been put in place because of me, because I was actually, the rule to some extent had been put in place because of some of the things that I had called the Hanhola in the year before that year, like the year before and the year before that, saying, guys, you have this problem with your students and you need to figure out a way to deal with it. Kids who were on Facebook, not, that were too young to be on Facebook, kids who were on Facebook using avatars that were just not a good idea for, children, et cetera, et cetera. So they knew that I wasn't the one they had to worry about. I suppose that's why they just, looked the other way. They did not continue with that particular rule because I think they must have gotten an enormous amount of pushback. But that's not the point. The point is that I did not sign that I was going to follow that rule. And in fact, my kids asked me about it later because they're like, well, if you say don't lie, like what about this rule? And I'm like, actually, I don't know if you noticed, but well, obviously they didn't notice, but I did not sign. And anybody who looked at the papers could see that I did not sign because they had like a whole stack of things that had to be signed. And this went back. So, I deliberately sent it back so they could see it was not signed. I didn't want and it was not signed. And they knew that I was not going to commit to that rule. So again, you have to know your school, but you need to really think about that. Same thing with internet access. Now, here's a very, very important thing when thinking about internet access. So there is an ongoing cost to internet access. You never, ever, ever want to be using your neighbor's unfiltered, unprotected Wi-Fi, because that is a recipe for you cannot filter things properly, and you cannot protect yourself from every shagets who is going to use this unprotected internet, this unprotected Wi-Fi to try to hack your computer, steal your passwords, get into your bank account, etc. Do not do it. It's not ehrlich and it's not safe. Okay, so there is an ongoing cost to internet access. Okay, so again, the question is, why are you getting internet access? Is it because it means that you can do some work from home that gives you flexibility? Does it mean that you can shop from home, which may or may not save you money, but will save you time and effort? Are you concerned about online shopping? For some people, online shopping is a stigmatizing because they wind up shopping way too much. And you have to know yourself, okay? For a lot of people, by the way, that particular issue tends to get overplayed for most people, but it is a real thing. It is a real thing. For some people, they do way too much shopping. So, you have to think about all these things. Again, this goes back to that list. But the main thing you need to think about, internet access is there is an ongoing cost. These, and then you go back to that list of the upsides, the downsides, and the mitigations. Okay. Social media is interesting because it's not always obvious what the upsides and downsides are. Generally speaking, again, younger kids should not need social media accounts. Also, younger kids are less safe because even when you lock it down, somebody who's really trying to be, who's a stalker, who's a predator, whatever, can often kind of get around some of the safety features of social media. They lie, they something slips, and then they convince your kid, whatever. So my tendency in general is the younger your child, the less safe and the less important it is for them to have social media apps or social media accounts. Okay. For adults, social media can be wonderful. It can be noxious. It can be poison. So you have to know, with social media, you have to know yourself. That's really the single most important thing. You have to know, what are you trying to accomplish with social media? And really, it's important to understand that if you're isolated, social media can be really helpful, but it's not going to solve certain types of problems. Okay. If you're isolated because you're physically have a hard time getting out of the house, social media can be very helpful. But social media relationships are not the same as in-person relationships. They're not. But they're better but they can help you maintain in-person relationships if you're, again, like I said, physically incapacitated, whatever. Social media can be a very useful professional. So my primary social media is Facebook, and I use that very little for personal stuff and very, very heavily for professional stuff. For other people, parenting groups can be wonderful. And again, you have to know yourself. You have to know the kind of parenting groups. You don't want to get yourself sucked into the ones that have negative, and there are some very, very negative parenting groups. If you're looking for, if you have a particular issue in your life, and there are sometimes, Facebook or, generally Facebook groups that can be extremely, extremely useful to you, to people who have that problem. Now, not all of these, it's not necessarily Facebook. There are organizations who have their own forums, etc. So, maybe that's where you want to go, again, depending on your particular situation. Some have both. And again, depending what you're doing. But there's a lot of support out there for social media, but there's also a lot of poison. And you have to really make that decision of what's the upside and what's the downside. How can I keep my limits? And if you feel like you cannot keep your limits, don't do social media. The truth of the matter is it's extremely rare that not having social media is going to have devastating effects. Again, for some people, it's really extremely useful, but it's not necessarily necessary for everybody. And then you've got the other communications apps. And like sometimes people get hung up, oh, is this a social media app or not? And that's not really the issue. The issue is what kind of communications does it facilitate? So let's say WhatsApp. WhatsApp, I hear so much, WhatsApp is terrible because of social media. WhatsApp has a lot of problems and it has a lot of pluses, but the problems about WhatsApp have nothing to do with it being officially social media. One of the big problems with WhatsApp is how easy it is to just pass on stuff without thinking it through. Okay, and this is true with most communications apps, right? Including even email, except that because of the format of email, it tends not to spread, even in the days when email was the primary communication source and you'd get all these chain emails. I did not get as many chain emails as I get WhatsApp forwards. Partly it's because more people have WhatsApp, but partly because, and I had talked about the concept of friction, WhatsApp has made it a lot more frictionless to just, you see something, boom, pass it on, much, much more easily. And so people do that. If that's a problem for you, then don't have WhatsApp. Maybe use a different messaging app that your family and people who you need to message with have, and that's it. You don't need to have specifically WhatsApp. But the key here is not to get hung up on, is it WhatsApp, is it social media, but does it enable the things I need? What do I need out of a messaging app? Does it enable the things I need? And does it make it reasonably easy for me to stay away from the things that are a problem? Okay. And this one has run a little bit longer because there's a lot of nitty-gritty here. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, so I see that we don't have any questions. So I will wrap it up. The bottom line is that you absolutely do need to, let me just check to make sure these, okay. The key thing to keep in mind is you need to make a decision and you need to think about it. You need to be willing to revisit your decisions. You need to be reasonable. You need to be realistic. And especially when you're dealing with your kids, obviously, you don't necessarily make the same decision for your kids as for yourself, and your kids are not always going to like your decisions. That's fine. But you need to be consistent in how you do your decisions if you want to have credibility and authority with your children. I mean, technically, halachically, hashkafically, you should have authority. But if you want your kids to respect your authority, and if you just want them to take you seriously, you need to be consistent about, how you make those decisions for yourself and for them. And, you need to be reasonable and realistic about what both the benefits and the dangers are, and plan for, I'm planning for this stuff, basically. Okay. So next week, we will be starting on the thing that I think most people are the most interested in, which is the specifics of technologies, how you, keep stuff safe. And that's going to be three sessions with different aspects of technology, how to, mitigate and make various aspects of technology safer. Have a good night. If anybody has a question that they don't want recorded,